Hi, so I am Bray Patrick Lake, and I am the Director of Stakeholder Engagement for the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And thank you so much for choosing this session. I think you always think when you're doing a breakout session, you feel like everybody's going to leave and it's going to be like 5 people. And so I'm honestly shocked that all of you stayed, and I'm delighted to have every single one of you. And I hope that we can get through the slides and then we can actually have some discussion. I've created a couple handouts that I want you all to take back to your organizations. And this is just kind of a teaser of some things that will be coming out on the city website later in October that will have a whole bunch of information. But I also want to let you know that I wear a number of different hats. So in addition to working at City, which is a program of Duke University, I come to this work from the patient background, and I am the president of a small foundation for patients with heart disease. I know how hard it is, everything that you all are doing. I came to this from a personal patient experience that was very dissatisfying, and then I started to realize that there weren't any standards for care, there weren't any answers about diagnosis and treatment, that clinical research was really failing in that space, and so I started seeking out people on the internet, which is probably a common story for many of you. We formed a patient group after realizing that there was no patient group in the space. And this was all in partnership with some of our medical advisors, who one of them was my physician at the time, and we really formed a partnership. But I also will be really honest with you. I've been doing that foundation for 5 years. We have no medical products that have successfully gotten through the regulatory hurdles. And in fact, we've had a number of trials that failed. And I will say that they were designed before the patient voice, like there was no partnership with patients, and so the trials were actually designed before we got into the space. But I want you to be mindful that the window of opportunity is limited. When I got into the space that I'm involved in, we had 6 sponsors that were willing to invest in trials. We now have 2 sponsors that are doing their best to actually get out of the business because trials have come, they have gone, they have failed, no products have reached market, and so this is a business for industry, and it makes it very, very hard. So I don't want to stand up here and say that I'm a total success story about some of these things, but what I've done is I've really tried to dedicate my life and my work to really focusing more on helping all and paving a road that others can drive on and that we can all kind of benefit and improve research for all patients. So with that, I also want to tell you I'm not good at technology. I usually screw this stuff up, and I was also the person that was like emailing slides to Global Genes at midnight, even though they wanted them a really long time ago. So some of the formatting's a little messed up, but I think it'll be okay. This is a disclaimer. I do work at Duke University, and I am an employee on a program that's FDA, public-private partnership, but because I've come from the patient perspective, Duke puts a disclaimer on almost anything I say because I'm pretty much an outlier and out of line, and I will always take the patient perspective and be kind of provocative about what we're doing and is it right for patients. So the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative formed basically because U.S. clinical trials are in crisis. For those of you that don't know, the trial startup times are lengthening, enrollment is slowing, costs are increasing. We actually have a project at City on investigator turnover because a number of investigators are simply just getting out of the business of research. And this is coming at a time when there's really increasing need for reliable evidence. Everything is evidence and data driven these days. So to evaluate new devices, new drugs, new biologics, comparative effectiveness, sometimes even comparing medical practices, and then comparative effectiveness on diagnosis and therapeutic options, and that's really affecting reimbursement in many ways. So City was, I've also recently gone blind, so bear with me as I'm trying to, the monitor's over here, and I'm going to try to multitask and actually do, I need extra hands. Okay. So anyway, City basically has a mission of identifying and promoting practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And we are a multi-stakeholder organization, which is really important because we believe that it takes everybody, there we go, being at the center of clinical research and clinical trials to make improvements. You can't make some type of solution and expect that if it was driven by one stakeholder view that it's going to be accepted and put into practice by all. So we try to bring all of the different partners together, and this is a snapshot of our current membership, which has industry, academia, patient groups, CROs, IRBs or institutional review boards, and government agencies all coming together trying to improve clinical trials. So we have a method about our madness. We're an evidence-based organization where we actually start and we target problem areas of clinical trials. We go out and we gather evidence. We try to identify barriers and solutions. We build consensus with everybody, and then we formulate recommendations, and now we're really focused a lot on implementing the change, because it's not just enough to say this is what we need to do. You actually have to go out and you have to get people to do it, and at the end of the day, we're hoping for better streamlined, more fit-for-purpose clinical trials. So why do we care? Because it's taking about 12 years or longer to bring a new treatment to patients. And the one thing that many of you in this room do not have and that your kids do not have is time. So I need you, during my whole presentation and this whole session, to think about these are the barriers, this is the cycle of time, what can I do to shorten it? And it doesn't matter if you're a patient group. The work of Citi and the particular project I'm going to speak to is focused on patient groups, but we look at patient groups as conveners and conduits for individual advocates. So even if you're just an individual, you don't have a group and you're not identified with anybody, well, except for you're here at Global Genes, so I know you're identified with an awesome organization that's doing a lot. But think about what can I do and what can my organization do to shorten this process, to lower the barriers, and to make this better for all, with the hope of getting treatments to market sooner. So I want to give you a couple depressing statistics about clinical trials. Recruitment challenges are rampant, and enrollment times are slipping. So basically, study timelines right now are actually being extended in many cases, sometimes to double their original duration. And whether this be an industry-sponsored trial or NIH, it actually is happening quite frequently in our NIH-funded trials, which is not a good use of your dollars, and it's not a good use of resources for patients. 11% of sites actually fail to enroll a single patient. It takes a heck of a lot to get a clinical trial site open. That infrastructure, getting everybody ready, getting everything off the ground, and it's really unbelievable to me that you could actually go through all of that and you could have a site that doesn't even recruit a single patient. 37% under-enroll, 39% will actually come in on target, and then we only have 13% that exceed their targets, and I believe that there are things that you guys can do that are in your power to help sites exceed their enrollment targets. So, the protocol for a clinical trial, if you're new to this, I like to call it the recipe for the clinical trial that outlines how we're going to do the trial, what are we going to measure, what are the procedures, what are the endpoints. But we have a lot of problems with protocols. There's one in particular that I hear regularly, and that is documented as far as the exclusion-inclusion criteria. They actually are so stringent that they don't meet any. There are no real patients like that. This happened in my condition, where when we started reading the protocols, and it's like, you know, why are we actually failing at this? And I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I was actually in a clinical trial that was aborted for low and slow enrollment. I had a device implanted in my heart, and then the trial was aborted, the study was never published, and no product reached market. So patients, in the end, we got nothing. The sponsor spent millions, and we all lost. But if you look at the inclusion criteria, you could see that there were very few patients in the country that actually looked like that. And so how it got designed in that way, again, without the patient voice, is to me always shocking, and that's something that patient groups can change. The study is not feasible. It doesn't take a brain surgeon. It just takes somebody often living with a condition. You do not have to be the chief scientific officer for your group to come in and say, you know, there's no way that as a patient I would undergo that number of procedures. Megan O'Boyle, who's live streaming, and I hope she's watching this session, from Phelan-McDermid syndrome, her child was the first one through a new study at NIH, and her child has autism and epilepsy. And they very quickly realized you can't schedule 7 procedures back to back for those kids and have them, you know, stay in a treatment room all day and see 5 different providers, because that's a very scary and stressful thing. So study feasibility, we really need to focus on that. Number of doses, number of appointments. Those of you that actually have, you might have a child with a rare disease, and then you probably have other kids in your family. How in the world are you going to fly across the country? Who's going to watch your kids? Are you going to put 5 kids on a flight so your one child can undergo study visits? Like, these are all just common sense things that come up in protocols that cause a lot of problems. And then we also have what we call Christmas tree syndrome, where there's the need to know versus want to know. And so instead of collecting what you actually need to know to answer the scientific question or figure out what the endpoint is and is a drug safe or effective, sponsors will start actually collecting everything under the sun, because if you miss your primary endpoint, then maybe you can go back and you can do a subgroup analysis and tease something out in the end and kind of, come up with a punt instead of actually scoring a goal. But we really have to get more fit for purpose. I saw some data that actually showed that it costs about $6 billion annually to collect non-core procedures. So core procedures basically support your clinical trial endpoint or some type of safety endpoint, but that $6 billion, and this is a global, not just in the US, is actually being spent on things that really aren't a need to know. So we need to be more mindful about that. So what if there are problems with the protocol? Tufts Center for Study of Drug Development had a nice assessment from, I believe it was 2002 to 2012, that showed that the number of amendments to a study protocol are up 68%, and that's really related to study complexity. Each amendment costs about $500,000 to implement, and it also takes about 8 weeks in your timeline. So if you look at your cycle time and how long can your kids wait to get or to get a treatment if they have one at all, that's really not acceptable. And so the typical phase 3 study has about 4 amendments right now. And Tufts actually had some data that showed that, I believe it was 40% of amendments were actually avoidable. And most of them occur before what we call first patient, first visit. And so they could have been taken care of before the clinical trial even opened. And so this is where you as the patient community can come in and say, let's take a look at this protocol and what can we do to improve it. So just a couple other dazzling issues with US clinical trials. We know that patient compliance with study treatment is an issue. If you designed a study and you've got some type of therapy that's being delivered, it could be 1 dose a day, and you've divided it up over 5 doses, we know that patients don't comply. We know that we have participants that will actually enroll in a study and either withdraw or be lost to follow-up. Many trials just can't even fit within medical practice, and so in rare disease, because you have centers of excellence, this might not apply so much. But it is an issue of infrastructure and efficiency, and how do we actually get patients into our trials, lower that threshold, make it minimum burden on them. So we need to start thinking about that. And then I mentioned earlier that we create all this standalone infrastructure where we go out and each time we do a trial, we pave a new road, which is kind of ridiculous. I think there's a session on PCORNet maybe later where they're trying to pave more of a national road as far as comparative effectiveness research, and I know that a lot of patient groups are actually doing a good job of actually setting up some clinical trial networks. But I would encourage you, if you have your standalone rare disease, to please look at some diseases that are similar. Do they have a network where you can add on something that they have experts that actually work in that same field? We need to start making one road that we can all drive on, because it costs a heck of a lot to pop open a study, build all of this, come up with data models, and then when we get done, we pack it up and we take it away. Even sometimes the clinical trial sites that actually aren't just investigators, but they're treating patients will say, I really like that software. This helped us manage our patients. Can we keep it? The answer is no, you can't unless you pay for it. So we actually take that away from them. And then in a study examining 302 new molecular entity submissions to the FDA, so 7.3% of those actually failed because the populations that were being studied didn't actually reflect the populations that were going to use a drug. Again, is this all good common sense? Like, to me, it's just like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And then I also heard that, I think it's another tough study, 19% of investigational new drug applications actually are successful, and so the new drug will reach market. And then only 16% actually recoup the investment that they made in clinical trials. So this is all important to you because you have expertise and assets that you can leverage that have value to industry. And we're going to start talking a little bit more about that in just a second. But I also want to talk to you about your role in talking about clinical trials and medical research. Research America in 2013 did kind of a landmark study that's cited most recently, or most prevalently for a recent study, where 7 in 10 doctors don't even talk about medical research. So you can go in, you can have your appointment, and you won't even know that there are clinical trials going on. So think about that in the role of the patient group. You guys need to be talking about clinical trials all the time. So I mentioned a clinical trial transformation initiative. We work in the clinical trials enterprise, and we work across a large variety of topics, as you can see. In red, we have the patient groups, and oh, you know what? I'm like advancing slides on my computer and not for you. Is this the best presentation you have ever seen? This is what I'm talking about. Okay, I don't know if you're sleeping, but I'm glad I caught this and I wasn't like on slide 40. Okay, good. I actually do this for a living. Isn't this amazing? Okay, So here's our portfolio of projects at City. In red, the Patient Groups and Clinical Trials Project. We ended up taking this on because we recognize that there's a gap in knowledge and understanding of actually how and when to engage with patient groups around clinical trials. I think in the rare disease community, you guys are really actually in better shape than most because culturally we've accepted you have to partner with patients, we have to find patients, we have to aggregate, we have to work in partnership. In chronic diseases, trust me, we're still struggling. But there's really not much empirical evidence about how these partnerships work and how to actually have a partnership that's successful. There aren't guidelines for best practices, and there certainly aren't actionable recommendations and metrics. So City is actually working in that space in addition to the best practices for effective engagement. With patient groups around clinical trials, we also have a value work stream that I think will be important as far as assessing patient group expertise and how that actually plays into return on investment. These are some of the experts that are working on this. We have a number of folks from rare disease that have been engaged with PPMD or Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, Tuberous Sclerosis Alliance, has helped inform some of the work that you will hear about. So I think there's been a common theme if you listen to Pat and Matt and Brad. So patient groups have changed, and there's really no one-size-fits-all patient group. And we know that American Cancer Society in 1913 started working on raising disease awareness, and then you kind of transition into policy. And right now, we are really seeing smart, fast groups who are taking their assets and leveraging them in milestone-driven research. And they're creating not only a value for their patients, but also for industry by doing this. But, you know, I keep hearing this where somebody actually, I think it was Faster Cures, you know, you're a co-pilot. That's great. I think we're drivers. We're driving research right now, and this is what I want you to do when you leave here today. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds about our project objectives. I just want you to know that we actually, at City, we gather evidence in a scientifically sound manner where we did a lit review. We did a survey that probably many of you took of 244 respondents from industry, academia, and patient groups. I think we had 61 from patient groups where we looked at all the different activities that people were engaged with, what were their objectives, what are the barriers to engagement, and then talk to us about successes and failures and some interviews, and we'll come up with some best practices. We had an expert meeting in January that was awesome, and we came out with recommendations that are before our executive committee right now, and I'm hoping they will be approved in the next week or two. So the handout I gave you takes all of the activities, not all of them, but many of them, across the research and development continuum. And we call it from bench to bedside and back. And this is all the different things that we've heard patient groups are doing. And again, that can lead to the shortened cycle times. And we think that through active and continuous engagement in the development program, and again, City is focused on clinical trials, but we realize it isn't just the clinical trial. A lot of this really starts in the pre-discovery and preclinical, where you guys need to bring your expertise and assets. So we know that you have a unique value to industry partners, and that actually by de-risking the early stage of development, and so you can either de-risk or you can also share the risk with some of the funding, you're reducing uncertainty. So FDA, everything is about uncertainty in the regulatory process. You probably hear industry sponsors over and over again saying, we want a guarantee. Well, there is no guarantee in this thing. So what can we do to take our assets and actually remove some of that uncertainty and lower the threshold again for success? So we also think that by working with patient groups, particularly in clinical trials, it makes them more effective and efficient. So we need you to bring the patient voice to the clinical trial to come up with some better study questions. I don't know how many times, and this again is more academic research than a product, but you hear about a question that is completely not important to patients in any way. The study design, which I mentioned about the protocols, endpoints is a big deal. The field that I work in, our endpoints are stroke and death. That's really awesome, but what if I survive it? Is there anything else that I would like to know if I'm going to use some type of product or therapy? What's my quality of life going to be? Mention the protocol amendments, procedures that are better suited to the patient, And then really coming up with what's important to the patient. And I think the PPMD story is so awesome as far as their benefit risk guidance and their therapy development guidance that they've worked on. The 6-minute walk test is really not a good measure for that community. And so we really have to keep fighting and push to get these things into the regulatory language that are important to patients. And I think it's so crazy that it's like we're constantly trying to fit the patient voice into this scientific and regulatory framework, and sometimes I feel like we should just, break the whole system down and start over with what's important to patients, and that we might get ahead faster, but we're constantly backfilling. And I think Mark Booten from National Health Council actually says, we're driving the car backward down the road, but we are making progress, and you guys, you can, through the patient voice, make these changes. And I had a quote, Holly P.A. actually, who used to work for Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. I think she's at RTI International now, but she still is their principal investigator on the Duchenne Connect patient-powered research network, was talking about how in the FDA process, they're seeking patient voice, and we've got patient voice, patient-focused drug development, and we really want to have better patient voice as far as benefit risk assessment. But the truth is, FDA deals in data. And so you guys really need to get smart about taking that patient story and not just having it be a great emotional story. We have a lot of great emotional stories going on. But if that doesn't translate to what's the unmet need, what's the symptom burden, how does this fit into a regulatory application, we're not going to get very far. So this is a grossly simplistic net present value graphic that basically just shows that if we take assets and we apply them to the preclinical, clinical, phase 1, phase 2, and through approval, we can actually shorten the cycle times, and then that will increase the return on investment for industry. And again, while we're helping people like us, industry is in a business, and so we need to make this all more attractive for them if they're going to partner with us. This isn't a talk on conflict of interest or legal, but in our city work, we did look into legal and compliance issues, and we just want to be very clear that there are no FDA regulations that are preventing the early engagement with patient groups around clinical trials. And that is true as long as it's not promotional. And so there's a couple of things to keep in mind. You'll hear sponsors, and again, I think rare disease is in better shape. Other diseases where sponsors won't engage with patient groups at all because they'll tell you FDA won't let us do it. Absolutely not true. But there are a couple of things that did come up when we were doing our interviews where companies were going out and instead of doing a focus group, maybe 3 focus groups of 10 patients or 100 patients, they were doing focus groups with 300 or 1,000 patients, and then you're kind of like, well, you don't have an approved therapy. You're reaching more and more patients, and people are really starting to want to get access to something that's not approved and hasn't been deemed safe or effective. So that was an issue with FDA. So beware. And then also beware of being involved in any type of promotional campaign for anything that is not approved, because you will get into trouble in that situation. So on your handouts, so I have the continuum, and then did everybody get, there were 2 different handouts. Yes. Let me, this one. Does everybody have this one? Okay. So this is a tool that will eventually be on the city website. It basically takes everything that you see in this really cool colorized graphic, and this is for you to take home today, but this is something that can be customized if you take it back to your organization, and you can kind of say, okay, as we go through these phases of clinical research, this is great, but my group either doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the capacity, isn't well formed enough to do this, and then you can customize and prioritize what your group is able to do. So all the talks this morning during the pre-discovery phase, bringing focus to your community by helping fund excellent science. We have in here including young investigators where needed, and I really feel like we've heard consistently going to that young, hungry, out-of-the-box thinking, smart investigators. I've heard from a number of patient groups if somebody's over 35, and I don't want to be discriminatory, but that they don't want to work with them. They want those young people that haven't been in the confines of academia and who really are the out-of-the-box thinkers. So convening the community to share ideas, that's not just bringing together the physicians. It's also, in many cases, bringing together patient groups. One of the #1 complaints I hear from industry is we don't know who to get engaged with, and they're all fighting, and it's just easier not to deal with them. So anything you guys can do, one sponsor was actually talking about how they were the convener, and they brought the patient groups in, and they got everybody to kind of stop fighting and focus on what was important, because they needed all the voices and not just the perspective of one group. So that's an important thing when convening people. You really do have the power to bring in people from around the world, the smartest scientists, bring in the funders, get venture philanthropy, excited about different things. Unmet need, I don't think we need to go into, but your patient stories, when you talk about the impact on the patient, make sure that that story really does wrap around to show that gap. What don't we have? What is my quality of life, and how could it be better if we had something else? And the other thing that is really important, I think, with FDA, I think people come in talking about a cure. That is, that's our dream for all of us. But short of that, what can we do to improve quality of life, and really getting smart about unmet need as far as just improving your daily quality of life? We've already talked a bit about, I think, translational tools such as biosamples. Natural history disease database is probably one of the most important resources that you can have. Critical to absolutely characterizing the disease, identifying mechanisms of damage or potential therapeutic action, and exploring biomarkers. As we go through these, and when you leave here today, again, you can talk about what you can do, what you haven't done. Very few groups actually offer the full complement, but as you grow, you can, but until then, you need to kind of go crawl, walk, run. What can I do when I go back and I talk to my board and we have only this many dollars? What can I do? And then educating and motivating the patient community to participate in and advocate for research, something that can be cheap through the use of social media. All right. Preclinical. So funding the studies is important. I think probably Brad really hit on some key points as far as, do you go for a $100,000 study or a $5,000 study? Do you do some type of, I think, hack this or crowdsource prize? Being an access to KOLs, that's what industry doesn't have a lot of times. They don't have the access to the academic key opinion leaders. And if you have relationships in that area, that could be incredibly important to help industry access that and capitalize on the value. And then being a matchmaker, making those introductions, very important. We heard great stories about the animal models this morning, so I will skip that. Facilitate sponsor interviews with patients, key opinion leaders, and around clinical trial design, power calculations, and consent forms. So how many of you guys actually have a program where you educate advocates and make them better research partners? Anyone? So let's say National Breast Cancer Coalition has Project Lead, Parkinson's Disease Foundation, they have patient advocates in research, and that can be a really good thing. So you can bring your individual patients in, and at least they would have heard of an informed consent form or an institutional review board. They can actually come in and help the sponsor work on key areas of the clinical trial. And sponsors are actually getting a little smarter about bringing patients in to do review of protocol and starting to understand that you actually, you can just bring any patients in, again, you guys being the conduit to the patients, and they don't have to have a lot of training as long as the sponsor actually does some type of orientation. All these things take care and feeding, but you as patient partners can actually do quite a bit on that, and just getting people to do webinars. Some of the umbrella organizations are doing trainings. And I think that's not a terribly hard thing to do. It does take sustained attention and actually planning. What do people need to know to participate in these areas? What is a clinical trial? What is drug development 101? How does this work? But don't fall into the trap of having a scientific officer and letting your board, and I think Brad said this, not know about research. This happened at my organization because I work on clinical trials, and my board was totally like, you got this covered. We don't really need to know. We trust you, and just come back with an update and tell us what we're doing. They participate in research, but they could do so much more, and it needs to not be just the one person, the one voice, so keep pushing that ball every single day. Collaborating with FDA around FDA guidance, I do think that is something where it takes a little more to get your feet underneath you to come in and actually be able to do that. but it can be done, and as some of you are getting more mature, and some of you might already be thinking about this, I know the PPMD team has been presenting repeatedly, and they are going to try to publish some work, as I understand it, that'll help everybody else kind of drive down that road, because they're amazing like that. But that is a huge win, and certainly a game changer if you can get a therapeutic development guidance accepted at FDA. Phase 1, so clinical research infrastructure. A lot of times we need to start with just even the care. Who's providing care? How do we provide care? What are we measuring? What are we collecting? That can actually turn into, your center of excellence can become a clinical trial site, and then you can start investing money in FTEs or employees that are actually supporting research and making it easier. It is hard when trials come in to grab somebody, get them up to speed in your disease, and put them on the ground, and so that's something that patient groups can actually do. Recruiting participants, I think, is probably the #1 thing where industry thinks, oh, we'll just reach out and we'll recruit participants through patient groups. Okay, so I consider that almost like a rescue. We want to have your voice all the way throughout the entire R&D program. And there are some patient groups, and hopefully you can get to this position where you can say, you know what, we're going to actually choose the sponsor we work with. In my field, we don't really have that luxury right now. We're just desperate to get any sponsor, but I do think you can still hold the line on that and say, you know what, we're not just going to put your stuff out on our website without being involved in design or helping you with forms or recruitment planning. And then supporting patient costs for the trial. I still am just shocked with what actually gets covered by either the sponsor or by insurance. And then, I don't know how many patient foundations get calls. I know mine did. I would like to participate in this trial, but I really don't even have the money. Or I've seen a lot of advertisements for, we're going to bill this to the patient. It's not covered under insurance. And I think that's just like, the stupidest thing you can do. If you're going to pop open a trial, at least make it so patients can participate. On this slide, probably something we haven't touched upon so much is patient preference studies and benefit risk. This is becoming much more important, and methods are actually evolving. So the science is an emerging science, but I worked on the Medical Device Innovation Consortium benefit risk framework and catalog, and this can be applied even in the drug development space. And so if you go on this website, take a look at the framework, but the catalog of methods doesn't change for how you elicit patient preferences. And again, this is taking some of what might be consumer-oriented science, discrete choice experiments, but really helping the FDA understand what your patient population will accept. So in PPMD, I think they said, for a modest benefit, we would be willing to accept one potentially serious adverse or life-threatening event, but we would not be willing to accept 2. And so there's a science around that that's emerging, and I think is a very good investment. And then you can read the full FDA benefit risk guidance for industry, great bedtime reading. And then patient-reported outcomes, quality of life measures, becoming more important. I participated in a workshop earlier this year for PROs, and I think it's frustrating. I don't understand why after 10 years, a lot of times we don't have validated patient-reported outcomes. So FDA is coming out with a compendium that basically will look at some of the tools that were qualified being over here, validated being over here. I work in this space and I still don't understand what's the valley of death in the middle. Why does it take 10 years? And so I think what happens a lot is that sponsors will just go to the reviewer and try to get something into an application, a regulatory application, instead of going through the 10-year process, because really, what's the point? And so in the end, we keep repeatedly ending up with no validated tool. And I'm not going to say too much about that, but we need to keep pushing for these, and I think it's an emerging field that we hear all the time, but I don't understand why it doesn't work. So I need your help. Come out here and let's keep going through this. Anybody with access to patients, you don't have to be a super sophisticated, expensive, or an organization with a high annual budget to review the patient-related materials and say, yep, this works, no, it doesn't. Somebody had a study brochure recently that said, we're investigating the contralateral breast. I can't use profanity, but it'd be like, what the is a contralateral breast? Does that speak to patients? Why are you handing that out? It's ridiculous as recruitment. So working on simple stuff like that. Some groups are actually putting out peer advocates to talk to patients about clinical research as they're going through consent. There is a little bit of conflict of interest with that. I know some organizations, because of liability, won't do that because they want to make sure that they don't actually misinterpret or feel like they're kind of pressuring patients to get into trials. But some groups are doing it. It seems to be working. Some groups are actually coming into sponsor meetings and looking at the data as it pertains to patients and saying, yes, we believe that this therapy is safe and effective. We do think there should be a phase 3 trial after phase 2. There's not too much burden on the patients. There's not too much risk. And so we like that, or saying that we are willing to accept that risk or help you identify a subgroup that would be willing to accept that risk. Has anybody actually served on an FDA Advisory Committee here? Okay. I serve on 2 as needed. So we have provide patient representative to serve on FDA Advisory Committee. This is a bit more of a formal process. I think anybody can apply to be part of the patient rep program if there's need. And then, but the FDA really kind of controls who gets to serve on the advisory committee. But you can make people aware that there is a patient like this and that we do have patients that are interested in serving. And it's an incredibly important voice. You can also provide testimony at the FDA hearings and advisory committee meetings. They're open to the public. You can submit your 3 minutes. Please, when you do that, even though I come from the patient community, when I sit on these panels, a lot of times it's a really great, moving, emotional story, and it's really uncomfortable because you're sitting up there, you're with a bunch of people, you don't want to be like crying in public. It's a horribly emotional story, but at the end of it, we didn't get any data or anything that we could say we should approve this product, and this is why. What we got is the best and saddest story you've ever heard, but in the end, it didn't change what the panel was going to do. So really think about that if you get involved in the FDA hearings. And then I have never done this, but I know that there are groups that are working on preparing submissions for newborn screening. And so on the city project, we asked for a definition, I think, Ron Bartek, I believe, from Friedreich's Ataxia actually provided most of the information, saying that if the disease is not currently being screened for in newborns, but the PG believes it can be shown, that the treatment being reviewed, if approved, can change outcomes for patients early in the diagnosed disease, and there's sufficient understanding of the disease's natural history being established, and a newborn screening test for the disease is available and reliable for both affected and unaffected infants. That'll be a very important thing because we know the earlier we screen, the earlier we treat, the better the outcomes are. I have absolutely no idea what time it is. Anybody want to yell out the time? 5 minutes. Cool. Okay, reimbursement, hugely important. Again, this requires data. Some groups are getting contacted, but this is why you need your patient registries and your post-marketing surveillance studies. We really need to be able to say, this was the unmet need, this is what the data is showing, people are improving outcomes. It can't just be a guess that we have some patients and that they would like to have access to this therapy. And as always, providing communications and support. Okay, no, go back. Okay, from our city survey, I just want to share with you some of the barriers that we elicited actually working with industry. 40% said insufficient tools for identifying and engaging relevant patient groups. 40% said they were unsure how to engage with patient groups. 36% said they had internal resistance or lack of buy-in. 33% said lack of funding. And 21% said lack of sophistication of PGs, patient groups. So these are all things that can be changed. We also did an affiliation gap ranking from some of the things that we revealed in the study. The survey is actually 110 pages of data, and we do have a manuscript that should be published shortly. But the good news is everything that's on this slide is a modifiable barrier. So in the dark blue, we have industry actually citing reasons or negative impacts on their relationships with patient groups is their own internal bureaucratic processes. And what's interesting, if you go down to probably 2/3 of the way down the slide, the light blue is the patient group saying we have unclear, ill-defined process within the patient groups. And then even further down, a stronger affiliation gap saying, the patient group saying the lack of understanding to the benefits of partnering with patient groups. So you guys need to make transparent what you do, what the value of it is, and make it easy to partner with you. So this is just a little framework that goes across all the different things that groups are doing. Some are working in multiple areas. Very few are working just in research because the education and the treatment and the patient support is super important, as is the policy. But just be sure that you know who you are and what you do. On your website, if you can take some of these things and describe what you do, the kind of assets you have a patient registry, your media reaches this many patients, you've had a success, you've funded this type of research, you have commented on this type of policy. It shows the sponsor what you're about, what you can do, what you bring to the game, and what your value is. This is some teaser recommendations. City has probably about 20 recommendations coming out for all stakeholders, for patient groups specifically, and then for sponsors of research. But again, so deploying the patient voice all the way through the R&D program to improve trial design and execution. We keep saying early and often. Again, you might get invited to the party for a phase 2B or a phase 3. Keep trying to move that back. Clearly define the expectations, roles, and responsibilities of all partners, and the data being shared and the objectives of your development program. So when you get into these partnerships with industry, some of them might just be handshake deals, some of them might be an MOU, some of them might be an NDA, depending on what you're being asked to do or a specific contract for services. Be clear on what you're bringing to the table, what you're getting out of it, and what everybody is expected to do. Always follow through on those commitments. I'm an information sharer. I share everything, and I tell people I get engaged with, if you don't tell me this is embargoed or that this data can't be shared, I'm going to share it with everybody. So make sure that you're very clear on what type of commitment you're getting into, and then be sure to honor that confidentiality. Work with multiple partners for a broader perspective to mitigate risk and enrich the pipeline development. So don't put your eggs in one basket. Unite your community. Bring people together and make that more attractive. And don't, that one researcher that's got the cure for your kid, just be careful about that. And then managing real or perceived conflicts of interest by establishing policies that require disclosure, transparency, and accountability. Being research ready, help your board have policies in place. Know whether your board members can invest in therapeutics before you're approached by an industry sponsor or before you reach out to an industry sponsor. We will have 11 more recommendations coming out at the beginning of October, I hope, at City, and you can go on our website and get those. So in sum, get educated or educate your constituents about the research and development process, and really start to get focused about clinical trial issues and opportunities. Make sure that your assets and expertise are visible and valuable to sponsors. And really find those opportunities to de-risk and improve the quality and efficiency of therapy development. So I will leave you with that. Maybe we'll get an extra 5 minutes because we started late. And some of the things that we saw outside that I just think are brilliant. So the roadmap to drug development that Global Genes put out, and then on their website, there's an entire document on how to effectively reach out to biotech that really would have been a lot of my, if we have 2 hours, we could go into how do you identify a sponsor, who do you reach out to. It's on their website, so I don't know how many of you read it, but it's an awesome document. And then there was a great white paper on the website as well for drug development. And with that, questions? Everybody's snoozing. Snoozing? Dazzled, thinking your head is so full. Okay. So if you guys go on the City website, you can register to receive our updates, and you'll get a notice about when these recommendations come out, because it's got an entire toolkit, and it's like 25 pages, and it's very complementary to what Global Genes is doing. So with that, thank you.
I'm sorry, I did have a question, but I was way over here in the corner. And,
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So first of all, thank you very much. I found this really, really informative, so thank you. And so some disease areas are lucky enough now to have a lot of different companies interested in launching clinical trials. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's a good thing in a sense, but it can also be a challenge when you have different companies in the same space.
So I think that goes to wisely choosing your partners. I don't have time to get into it, and it will be in the City recommendations, but it is on the Global Genes website right now. As far as how you actually assess partners, is there going to be meaningful engagement? Are people going to share information? Are they going to give you updates? We know that some companies actually will come in and say, hey, we work with patients, we're big on patient engagement. You can outline and say, okay, we want to work on the informed consent form, we'll help you with recruitment. We want somebody on the data safety monitoring board. But there are patient groups that will tell you, it's funny, the steering committee for the study or the DSMB actually met 4 times and never convened, never invited the patient. So that's stuff that's in the ethers and that we don't have good evidence in, although I know, I think industry keeps tabs on a lot of things and there's data, but I'm not sure, short of talking to your peers, how you actually know that, but there is a framework actually that Global Genes has to say, kick the tires a little and figure out. I know if you're like, I feel like in my space, beggars can't be choosers, but we can still push and say, this is to us what a meaningful partnership is. Faster Cures is actually working on the IP issue, so if you guys are interested in IP, and I think Health Research Alliance too, as far as some of the, how do we do the data sharing agreements, what do we get out of it? The venture philanthropy is more the trained community for Faster Cures. Good? Hi.
So we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So sort of the short of the long is that there's a really great drug in pipeline right now called the FE743, and its original indication is for mitochondrial disease, so it's been working really, really well. But so I would fit the criteria between 2 and 11. I mean, people tell me I look young, but I think 11's pushing it. But you get more data if you did like up to 2.
Right.
2 to 11, 11 to 18, 18 to 26, 26 to, I don't know, on and up in increments. Instead of just saying, okay, we're just going to sample size, because in that trial you can have undiagnosed, you have neuro, you have mito, so you have a whole wide range of diseases, but the only sort of killer is the age range.
Okay. So that's inclusion-exclusion criteria. That is something, even if you're a Google group of 5 patients like you, make it aware, make the sponsor aware that there are 5 of us that need this. Say how many people are out here that are like this, and one, find out why did they pick 2 to 11? What is that part of just pediatric guidelines? Like, what's the logic? Make them aware that there's an unmet need and that there's a group that would be willing to participate in the clinical trial.
Because then you would effectively blow it up to everyone.
Yeah, and they're probably going to want to know what's the market too. Like, again, even though it's our lives, it's return on investment.
Thanks.
Well, I hope it's more than one, but yeah. Okay, thank you.